Emergency room nurse here. An elderly lady came in by ambulance. Near death. She was a DNR, so we weren't going to do much for her. She didn't have any family that we could find. The hospital was full, so we had to keep her in the ER for the night. Again, she was near death. When you've seen enough people die, there's no mistaking it, and she was almost there. Barely responsive. Pale, cool, with really irregular breaths. Her heart rate was up and down too. We just turned the lights down and kept an eye on her monitor, basically waiting for her to die. About an hour later, she's standing at the door of her room. She'd gotten up and put on all her clothes. We were all like, WTF? One of the nurses went to check on her, and she said she was hungry. Not really knowing what to make of things, we got her a chair, a bedside table, and went to the cafeteria to get her a tray of food. The lady sat there, ate all her food, and talked with the staff a little. After about an hour, she told her nurse that she was tired and wanted to lie back down. We helped her back into bed, and within 30 minutes she was dead. Not exactly paranormal, but in 22 years in busy inner-city ERs, it's the weirdest thing I've seen. I used to work in a skilled nursing facility. I was usually assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. One night, I was in the linen room stocking my cart, and I heard someone shuffle up behind me. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and there was no one else in the room. The door was still shut too. Another lady started to complain that a man was coming into her room at night. Again, Alzheimer's, so I didn't think much of it. To reassure her, I told her I'd check on her throughout the night. She complained about this man every night for 2 more weeks. When I asked her to describe him to me, she said, "He's real handsome and wears a black suit. He's right behind you now, honey." That freaked me out. Of course, there was no one behind me. She died the next night in her sleep. I work at a psychiatric hospital. I won't give too many details due to Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, but this situation was quite unusual. We had a very young girl who had attempted to hang herself a couple of times, which is highly unusual for someone her age. She was also a very talented artist, but her parents brought in a couple of drawings she had done that were very different from her usual work. They depicted crude stick figures hanging, stabbing people, and strangling others. This girl was Native American, so her uncle came in to perform a smudging ceremony, which is a Native American ritual for exorcism of demons. I supervised the smudging because we had to take her outside for it. When we came back inside, she started giggling in a high-pitched manner after not smiling for days, and the television next to her suddenly turned off. All the lights above her began flickering. I worked at a hospital doing transport for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done and supplies are also sorted. I hated working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner expecting to see my only coworker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walked into the hallway, and a bed was rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides. At this point, I thought that my coworker was messing with me. I radioed him, and he said he was upstairs in the cafeteria. Still not believing him, I thought I'd catch him in the act. I walked past the laundry room, and the machine started. I popped my head in there expecting to find him, but it was completely empty. Okay, I'm starting to get a little nervous. I walked into the laundry room, and the machines completely stopped. I froze, then ran out and headed towards the elevator when I heard whistling again. At this point, I knew I was the only worker in the basement. As I was standing there waiting for the elevator, things started falling off the shelves down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I was literally standing there watching them fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway. I kid you not, my entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on end, and I had this strong gut feeling I was being watched. I was not alone. As I was getting into the elevator, I felt something brushing my arm. I went upstairs and found my coworker in the cafeteria. freaked out to him. I got the hell out of there and transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add to it is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It was almost as if the spirit was mimicking me. Creepiest feeling ever. I had cared for an elderly woman with no family who came to us when her husband died. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was usually just words that made no sense together. I felt so bad for her because ever since she had arrived, so many of the residents in her area whom she seemed to enjoy spending time with had passed away in such a short time span. She put up a picture of each of them next to her pictures of her husband and several others who were probably family, to remember them. I had always felt sorry for her and showed her extra attention, and we became close. It just seemed so unfair that she had such bad luck and kept losing people that she cared about. One day she looked at me and said plain as day, "Sweetie, I think I'm done now," and handed me a picture. It was a picture of me, and I smiled because it touched my heart that I was that important to her. She passed nearly a week later, and I cried for days. It hit me really hard. She knew it was the end for her, and she said goodbye as best she could. A little less than 2 years later, I was talking with a colleague and she came up in conversation. My colleague referred to her as "that crazy bitch," which seemed very out of character for her and shocked and offended me deeply. I expressed this to her, not so nicely, and she looked at me with a shocked look and said, "Oh dear, do you not know?" And then explained something to me that I hadn't known. As it turned out, it came out sometime after she had passed that she had killed her husband by poisoning him, and that there was an investigation because it appeared that she had a ritual of befriending someone, obtaining a picture of them, and hiding the picture until she could kill them, usually by poisoning, and then displaying the picture as a sort of trophy. It was suspected that this may have been the reason for the spike in the mortality rate during her stay and the considerable number of photos in her collection. The last I heard, the old family photos weren't any relation to her, and the police were trying to ID the individuals and compare them to several cold cases. I saw a mannequin blink. This happened while I was still training to be a CNA, certified nursing assistant, at our local community college. We used regular, non-horrifying mannequins for practicing dressing, bathing, and bedmaking. They even had attachments for catheters. However, we didn't keep all the equipment in the classroom. There was a small locked back room where we stored some items. One day, I volunteered to retrieve something from there. I think it was clothes for the mannequins. When I unlocked the door, the room was pitch black, as if it absorbed the light from the main room. I flipped on the ceiling light, and there on a worn stretcher before me lay the most inhuman and terrifying-looking mannequin I had ever seen. I'm not sure what the manufacturers use as a reference when making their faces, but it certainly didn't resemble anything human. Its features were twisted in agony. It looked like it was in pain. It was incredibly creepy. I quickly grabbed the items our teacher needed, and as I glanced back, I swear I saw one of its plastic eyelids close and then open. Completely freaked me out, and I avoided going into that room for the rest of the course. I worked in a hospital as a certified nursing assistant for over 2 years. Whenever a patient mentioned having a dream about a cat, they would code within 24 hours. This was particularly unusual because it wasn't a hospital where people coded frequently. I once got into an argument with a doctor about it. The SWAT nurse had mentioned that a patient had dreamed about a cat, so he was planning to keep a closer eye on him. The doctor, who wasn't even involved in the conversation, dismissed it and insisted that it was completely impossible. He told us he was the doctor and to stop discussing it. I retorted that I didn't realize his MD came with a degree in paranormal psychology. He didn't take kindly to that. Anyways, I'm not sure if it's paranormal or if maybe we have a social or cultural awareness of cats as omens, so our subconscious brings them to the forefront when something is going wrong. And in case you were wondering, the patient mentioned above coded and passed away later that evening. Spooky stuff. I have a couple of stories, one from my mother and one from me. My mother's is probably the creepiest and has always stuck with me, especially with all the paranormal stuff she has seen. My mom worked the night shift at a hospital in Arizona, in a town near the border, and of course it was an old mining town. Anyways, she's going room to room when an old lady who walked the halls due to insomnia tells her about some weird goat man trying to get in through the doors. My mom didn't think much of it, but being Catholic, she had moments of silently praying to herself. After a few moments, there was a shriek. She couldn't explain it, but it was a horrible shriek that made your blood turn to ice. She went to the nurse's station to ask if anyone else heard it, and they did. Turns out, the shriek was heard all around the hospital, freaking everyone out, especially the religious folks into paranormal activities. A few of them looked out the windows and saw hoof marks by the doors and windows, with no trail leading towards or away from the building. My story was pretty creepy too. I also became a CNA and worked in a lockdown dementia and Alzheimer's unit at night. I've had my share of eerie moments, but this one will always stick with me. I was finishing up my paperwork when a light went off down the hall. Since the other CNA was busy with someone else, I grabbed it, punched in my code, and went out to investigate. I asked if everything was okay. Sleepily, my little lady told me there was a darn woman knocking on her window wanting to come in, and she really wanted to go back to sleep. She insisted I go and let her in. I thought to myself, oh no, this sounds all too familiar. I reassured her, peeked out the window, nothing. Maybe she was dreaming, really tired, and mistook it for her roommate. After that incident, I returned to my unit. I sat down, had a snack, chatted with my head nurse, and talked with my usual insomniacs. It was around 3 a.m. now. Suddenly, the light went off again, this time in my unit. Mind you, this unit has no outgoing phone lines. I headed down to her hall and asked if everything was okay. My lady said she couldn't sleep because someone kept banging on her window and she was scared. I pretty much nearly panicked at this point. I told my nurse, and she laughed, saying this has been happening for years. Great. I worked as an emergency room attendant before med school, and one night a security guard came bolting down the hallway, warning everyone not to use the taps. Naturally, a nurse was right in the middle of washing her hands, so she freaked out, flinging her hands in the air, thinking the taps were poisoned or something. I'm not sure what her reasoning was, but I digress. The security guard asked her if the water was really hot, but she replied that it was only lukewarm at best. Here's what had happened. He was using the restroom on the 3rd floor and got splashed on the behind with boiling hot water. His first assumption was a boiler malfunction, closely followed by speculation about a fire in the walls boiling the water in the pipes. The security team brought in the fire department just in case, and they conducted thorough system checks with the water shut off. However, they found nothing, no fire, no other hot water issues, except in his one magical, ghost-infested throne on the 3rd floor. The older staff always claimed that the ambulatory care unit was haunted by a ghost named Winnie, an old nurse who had died while at work. Coincidentally, the toilet the guard was using was directly above the unit, albeit 2 floors up. I'll never forget how freaked out he looked, thinking he was splashed on the butt by a mischievous old nurse lady ghost. My mom used to work as an RN at a hospital in a small western town connected to a senior living home. She often worked overnight shifts, overseeing both facilities with the help of 1 or 2 CNAs. Over her decade-long tenure there, she encountered an apparition about 6 or 7 times, known among staff as the Man in Black. Each sighting was eerily similar, occurring in different locations within the building. During her rounds, which included checking vitals and attending to patients, she would often turn a corner from the nurse's station towards the hospital beds or the senior home. It was then that she would see the apparition, either immediately after rounding a corner or stepping out of a room. The figure was dressed in a black, Old West-style suit with worn cowboy boots and a matching hat. His face was indistinct, as though it had been smudged or blurred, despite his imposing height of 6 feet 5 inches compared to her 5 feet 5 inches. He would stand and look at her before entering the room he appeared near. Whenever she investigated, the room would be empty with nothing out of place. Initially terrifying, my mom eventually grew accustomed to the sightings, though they always signaled extra attention to the patient in that room. What made these encounters even more unsettling was that in about 90% of cases reported by other RNs, the patient's health deteriorated over the next few days, often resulting in their passing shortly after. Consequently, whenever the overnight RN spotted the Man in Black, extra precautions were taken with the patient. Strangely, the apparition was only seen by the RNs. Not a single CNA reported a sighting. My mom believed he appeared to those who could help the most, while I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was a haunting reminder of impending events beyond anyone's control. Even though I'm not an RN and haven't seen him myself, the story still sends chills down my spine whenever my mom points out where she encountered him in the hospital corridors. I used to be a registered nurse in our local ER. A couple of years ago, we were relaxing because it was pretty slow, and we got a call from one of the local city's ambulances. They called saying they were bringing in a guy from a 911 call and that he was going into shock, so we needed to be ready for their arrival. They arrived, and we were waiting by the door, ready to go. They brought in this guy, probably around 20, and said he was dehydrated and suffering from alcohol poisoning to an extreme degree. Anyway, we took him to a room and the doctors, and we started hooking him up to everything. The whole time, we were on the verge of losing him. We got him stabilized and induced him into a coma. He came out of it in about a week or so, which was pretty quick from what I've seen. One night, I went in to make my checks and saw a few people standing around him, talking. This was weird not only because it was around 3 a.m., but also because our hospital is the main one in a decently populated area. We get guests, but not every night, and I didn't remember anyone coming in that night, let alone a whole family. I stepped out to ask my buddy if we had any overnight visitors, and he said no. By this point, I was a bit confused. How could a group of people just walk into our ER without anyone noticing? I went back, and I kid you not, they were gone. I stepped out of the room for like 15 seconds, and they vanished. I'm still freaked out about it to this day. Needless to say, I had my friend walk with me the rest of the night while doing checks. I work in an inpatient hospital pharmacy. My hospital is fairly old and has seen its fair share of people. For example, we used to house a hospice unit in the basement. One thing I have not personally seen but know of through several coworkers is a person who wanders around our C-section area in our labor and delivery unit. It has always been the labor and delivery unit, so I am not sure who this person is. You only catch glimpses of them passing by out of your peripheral vision, and it's always a little further down the hallway than you are. Working the third shift can be creepy because, as an older hospital, there are a lot of noises. Mostly everything is quiet, and there are no interactive spirits. I have had to sleep over when there has been bad weather and I have to be back in after 8 hours. During those times, I have slept in empty rooms in the C-section hallway. I have never had any disturbances but rather felt calm, though it always felt as if someone was in the adjacent room when I knew I was the only one there. My mom also works at the hospital as an ICU nurse. She has had patients state that someone came into their room to tuck them in or just stare at them, but no nurse had done so when the patient states it happened. They often state that the ghost will walk into the room, stay a minute, and then leave. My mom also said that she has had patients talk about either a cat or a dog that walks outside the patient's rooms and jumps onto the beds. I used to work as a CNA in an assisted living facility. The first year working with a patient privately went smoothly, with no issues or strange occurrences. Then I was asked to work overnight shifts, which started off well enough. I tried to nap during the night whenever possible, but a couple of months in, I began waking up abruptly during my naps, feeling startled into wakefulness. Soon after, I started waking up to what felt like someone whispering my name in my ear. It was creepy, but I initially dismissed it as possibly just a dream. A week later, though, I woke up to a voice shouting my name loudly and violently, echoing across the room when I fully awakened. Maybe it was still a dream? I wasn't sure. Then things took a turn. My patient began seeing things, talking to people who weren't there, accusing me of drugging her, and seeing strange men in the window and people hiding in her closets. I suspected she might have a UTI, but it turned out she actually had pneumonia and was hospitalized for a few days. The worst part came after all this. Every day at 5:45 p.m., my patient would go to the dining hall for dinner, giving me an hour's break. One day in mid-January last year, after a day of cleaning, I felt a bit grimy and decided to take a long, steamy shower that fogged up all the windows. When I exited the bathroom, dressed and dried, My eyes were drawn to the window near my patient's bed. There was a handprint clearly outlined in the upper right corner. The suite's door had been locked, and my patient, who was incredibly short and immobile without her scooter due to polio paralysis, couldn't have reached the window. Moreover, the handprint had only 4 fingers, unadulterated. Absolute anxiety set in when faced with this physical evidence. That handprint will forever haunt my memory, challenging my logical, cynical side. I'm not a religious woman, but I would have prayed the rosary at that moment if I could find the right beads. My patient eventually moved, no longer seeing people in her windows and closets. Turns out she didn't have dementia after all, and I no longer felt that terrifying, hair-raising sensation of something malicious following me home from work at night. Damn Delamere Woods. Subscribe if you enjoy the video or watch another.